Hello and welcome to Moodle. I mentioned earlier during the first day of school that we will occasionally be doing some notes at home in order to have more time in class to analyze. We're going to start that today with some elements of fiction terminology that's probably familiar to you, but that we want to review just in case to make sure we've all got the same language to use. So if you want to have your guided notes next to you, often what is in bold in this presentation is what you'll need to fill in your notes. And if you have any questions at all, please mark those on your notes and I will answer them in class on Monday. So to start, the element of fiction that we're going to focus on is the most basic, and that is, of course, plot. Plot defined is really simply the author's arrangement of events or incidents in a story. It's literally what happens. It's also the organizing principle that controls the order of events. And those events are propelled by a conflict. As we saw in the scenarios we looked at in class on Friday in the grocery store with Lily and her dad, the more interesting story was the one that had the stronger conflict. The father doesn't know what happened to his daughter in the grocery store. Also with the Hemingway story, many of you argued that it wasn't a story, in fact, because it didn't have a beginning, middle, or an end. Of course, many people came back and made the argument that it did, but plot implies that we have a beginning, a middle, and end, that something happens and things are put in conflict and then finally resolved. Plot also involves relationships and connections between events. Let's think of the domino effect. One event leads to the next. There are several types of plot that authors have to choose from, and they'll often borrow multiple, not simply one. The most basic is the chronological plot, and it's the most realistic because we experience our lives chronologically, of course. It's the most common way to develop a story, the easiest plot device to use, and it's simply told in the order that it occurred. You can think of all sorts of movies or TV shows that use a chronological approach. If you could jot down in your notes perhaps an example of a film, a short story, or a book that uses a chronological approach, you can share that out in class on Monday. A lot of authors and filmmakers also use flashbacks and flash forwards. Flash forwards are a little more rare, but the narrator is speaking in the present day, but the plot will unfold by looking back or looking forward. And this is used quite a bit, often to develop tension. Even though we are living chronologically in the present, think about how many times you reflect on something that's happened in the past, or you worry about or get excited about something that might happen in the future. It's a little more complicated to understand in a story, but essentially a flashback is an interjected scene that takes the narrative backward in time. A flash forward takes it forward in time. Many of you guys are fans of the show Lost. It's been off the air for a couple of years, but they did something that was really innovative at the time, and they used flash forwards, where they would look at where the characters were who got off the island were several years later. And that really developed our attention about how did those characters get there and what's going to happen. How did they get to this place off of the island? More commonly, flashback is used. So think about a couple of examples of stories. I'm thinking right now of Harry Potter. He often flashes back to things that have happened in his past. So authors use them all the time, especially to develop internal conflict, but sometimes more than that. Plot types continued. A term that you'll hear me use throughout the year is a Greek term, in medias res, or in medias res. It's pronounced a couple of different ways. It literally means in the middle of things. And it describes a narrative that begins not at the beginning of a story, but somewhere in the middle. If we began at the beginning of a story, the story would be tedious. It would be incredibly long. So oftentimes authors begin at some crucial point in the action. You can usually see this a lot of times in action movies when they'll open in the middle of a car chase or something like that to grab the reader's attention, because we don't need to know all the junk that happens at the beginning. We want to know, when is the conflict about to happen? So also in your notes, jot down a couple of examples of either films or short stories or books that you've read that you think begin in the middle of things. When we're talking about plot, we need to talk about a guy named Gustav Freytag. He developed a pyramid that describes the structure of plot, and it's a method to analyze the different components of a plot. So here is his what is called Freytag's pyramid, and it has 5 parts that you can write in to your notes. Let's start with the first stage, the exposition. The exposition is simply the introductory material that creates the tone. It gives the setting, it introduces the characters, and supplies other facts necessary for the situation. It lets us know where are we, what's the world like that we're going to be spending some time with in this story. And a lot of times we're tempted to skip over the exposition. It's not as interesting. But as we'll see, especially with Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, the exposition can be incredibly important, and you need to make sure that you don't skip over it. Next is the rising action. And really, the rising action is a series of complications. So we're introduced to the world, and then things start to get a little bit complicated. So it helps the reader gain some interest. It puts groups in conflict with one another. Things start to get a little messy in the rising action. And that's going to create conflict and lead to the next part of the plot, which is climax. The climax is the turning point. It is sometimes the point at which nothing else could go back the way it was before. So it's got the greatest emotional tension, and it's the moment where the reader is the most engaged, when you're uncertain what's going to happen and things could not go back to the way they were before. We move next to the falling action, and sometimes that's paired with a French word that's pronounced denouement. And denouement, let's start with that for a second, because it literally translates as untying the knot. So if you think of rising action as getting things messy, the climax is like the most intense moment of that messiness. The falling action is all about untying the knot and working out the messiness of the conflict in the climax. Okay, so it winds down in a sense. Finally, we have to close with a resolution. That's the end of the falling action, the solution of the conflict. But keep in mind, resolution is not always a happy ending. In fact, stories that have that happy ending and they all lived happily ever after, as we saw on Friday, those are not the most interesting stories. That oftentimes, especially in real life, there isn't really a resolution. Think about how many movies end with a blank screen. That if you watch the series The Sopranos, that was the final episode, went to a blank screen, and there was this ambiguity about what happened. So the resolution is supposed to resolve everything, and in the beginning stories, older stories, it usually does, but in more modern stories, authors resist resolving everything nicely. If you look at this pyramid, all these parts seem to be about equal. However, oftentimes, the first 3 parts, exposition, rising action, and climax, are the largest chunk of the book, and then falling action and resolution can be quite close to one another. So those are your notes for plot. What I'd like you to think about tonight or over the weekend, because on Monday I'll ask you to discuss it with a partner, is how might mapping a plot's structure help you to understand that story better? How is it going to be helpful for us to employ these terms to understanding the stories that we read? Make sure that you've got your notes filled in, and when I've asked you to think of some examples, you've got that. And then you can apply these notes to the story Little Brother, and it's going to feel like it's missing an ending. That is because the endings, I purposely took it off. So read and annotate the story for the different plot parts, and come prepared to discuss on Monday. Thanks so much, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.